thank you all very much. I know you've had a long day, and it's nice to see you're all looking quite bright, and so that's good. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you for your long and interesting day, but I was being a discussant at a different part of the university at a workshop about rating systems and feedback systems, and I'll share some of what I've learned today with you and some of what I'm going to say now. And I'd also like to thank Eric and Anna-Marie and Ian and Bill and everybody at the OII who's made this possible. It's very nice to be here, as it always is. So, as Ian just reminded us, the title of this debate is, Will Design of the Future Internet be Driven by Technology or Societal Concerns? Now, of course, with an academic, the answer is both. Or more precisely, that technology and society design or construct each other. Our societies, our political systems, our economies, our interpersonal interactions are all affected by the means available to us for making things, for moving around, for producing energy, for communicating with one another. We live in a world that is thoroughly technological, and to imagine this that there would be some purely separate social thing, I think is a bit mistaken and idealistic. And I want to make three kind of big points, and if I have time, three small points, otherwise I'll save my small points for the discussion. And the three sort of bigger points are that which future or futures, I think more accurately, depends on which histories, and that history matters. Second point, as Ian already kind of previewed, is that technological determinism also matters. And thirdly, for those of you who have spent any time hanging around science and technology studies kind of circles, that artifacts have politics and that politics have artifacts. So first of all, history matters. Now, as technologies become established and part of our everyday worlds, we often forget to reflect about how they came about, how they exist alongside other older technologies, and how they interact with other older and existing social forms and social relations. This is especially true when, as with the internet, there's sometimes enormous hype surrounding the importance of the technology and its transformative kind of power and potential. So one of the reactions to, is what the design, what will it be driven by? I was kind of doing a little bit of crowdsourcing when preparing this and talked to a few people, and one of the responses I got was, well, it's just infrastructure. It's just like electricity, as if this somehow kind of avoided the question or answered it, that it didn't matter anymore. And actually, most of us, probably even science and technology studies people like myself, aren't bothered most of the time about how electricity or broadcasting or sewage or water supply or other infrastructure systems actually work, until they break down, that is. And increasingly, we do take the internet and its working for granted. And increasingly, its workings are themselves black boxed. But some of us are kind of old and remember when it was different. And actually, as I was preparing today, I was very excited because I was going to see Robin, who I've known for a very long time. And I can remember sending Robin an email in about 1988. There was young people, there was email then. And but it was one of those text editors that if you made a mistake, you couldn't kind of go back and you couldn't go up. And I can remember once trying to send him a rather sensitive email. I can't remember what about, but I remember it was sensitive, and I didn't want mistakes. Eventually, I just abandoned it, and I think sent him a letter or something. But because I got so frustrated with this text editor that wouldn't allow me to correct. But now, sending an email, it's routine, it's easy, you can correct things, and we don't kind of worry too much about how that works or how that came about. But it did used to be a lot messier. And there used to be alternative ways of communicating data digitally, also in the 1980s, what we used to call OSI networks. Again, kind of blast for the past for the old people. And some of these also received massive government support from the British government, from the American government, from the EU, of all sorts of different types. And what we think of as the internet today, based on ARPANET, using TCP/IP protocols, offering services such as email, file transfer, and the World Wide Web, were all developed within academic research contexts. And with those old systems, the ones we've now forgotten about or become kind of footnotes in the great and glorious history of the internet, there was much more power and control in the network rather than in the individual computers. And the way in which this kind of battle around standards and protocols got played out has had important economic, political, and technical implications. So I think it's important to remember history, the history of the internet and its alternatives, as a reminder that things might have been otherwise and that they might be different in the future. So I think this helps us to resist internalist accounts, still common in the history of technologies, and it helps us to resist the tendency to black box the current internet. Remembering the past and understanding those choices helps us to realize that there are choices for the future. The other little lesson from this kind of, little history story is that public funding is extremely important. Particularly the TCP/IP and the World Wide Web were largely the result of kind of major bits of public funding in different countries. And I think one of the reasons it's taken the shape it has is because they were developed within an academic system that had, as a kind of ideal at least, a notion of sharing and openness. So that's what I wanted to say about history. Second point is about technological determinism. Now, sorry if I'm beginning to sound like a first-year kind of tutor, but now technological determinism is the idea that technological change causes social change, that technologies are developed outside of societies, the result of scientific and engineering activities, and then launched into the world with more or less profound consequences. And this is a remarkably robust and enduring idea. It endures in the accounts of some analysts. It endures in the accounts of actions of, in the actions of systems builders, as well as the justifications often put forward by policymakers and others. And despite all of the very detailed and careful empirical work about both historical and contemporary examples of the contingency of technological change, and despite the very nuanced and sophisticated theoretical alternatives that have been proposed, technological determinism persists. And there are different types of technological determinism. I won't go into that here, but there's one which I call justificatory technological determinism, the type that is largely deployed by social actors, when employers use it to justify downsizing and reorganization. It's often found in policy documents, or in the hype around Web 2.0 leading to, more equal patient-doctor relationships. And it's the technological determinism that we're kind of sometimes susceptible to ourselves when we think about how the world has changed in the past couple of hundred years. And it's probably also this is a different kind of technological determinism, the frustration you feel when confronted with, an automated call system, for example. But it remains in the justifications of actors who are keen to promote a particular direction of change. And it remains as a heuristic for organizing accounts of technological change and part of a broader public discourse which seeks to render technology opaque and beyond political intervention and control. And I think we need to take this kind of technological determinism seriously in order to understand the dynamics of socio-technical systems and the rhetorical devices that are sometimes used by technology developers and policymakers to justify particular kinds of technological choices. So when people make claims about technology, that it's inevitable, that we have to do this to keep up with China, or that it's revolutionizing certain aspects of social life, then I think it's really important to kind of ask yourself, why is this person saying this? What's at stake here? What are they trying to hide? Don't want to be too conspiracy-minded about this, but I think it's always good to ask these kinds of fairly basic critical questions. Third point I want to make is the artifacts have politics and politics have artifacts. Those of you might recognize the reference to Langdon Winner's work on the bridges and underpasses in New York and some of the debate that followed that. So there's a small distinction I want to make between politics on the internet, the kind of, which is probably the most discussed, the websites of political parties, online voting systems, I don't want to particularly talk about that, but that's one kind of politics. There's another kind of politics about the internet, copyright, surveillance, various forms of regulation. And there's the politics of the internet itself, of the design, of search engines. And when I talk about this with students, it's the politics of they often find most difficult to grasp. It's a nice article, some of you may know, by Entrona and Nissenbaum about the politics of search engines. It's quite old now, but it's still a nice article. And it kind of explains very carefully about how search engines are designed in particular ways to get certain things coming up top. I mean, I'm sure you all know this very well. But a lot of my students aren't that bothered about this sort of thing. They say things like, well, you know, you got to organize and design a search engine somehow. Why not this way? It's good as any other. The idea that different designs bring you different information, that this is sometimes opaque, seems to be something, you know, they don't understand why people like me get bothered about this. The combination of the politics of and the politics about is even more difficult. So things that are happening in copyright, and maybe some of the others will talk a bit more about this. I mean, nowadays, of course, we all know it's incredibly easy to copy information. Music, text, films, data, any kind of information. Now, you could have just, you know, legal regulations. That's what we had in the past. It said, you know, you can't do this, or only under certain circumstances, or only when authors have been dead for 50 years, or that we have kind of rules for this. But those rules didn't get us very far with regulating digital information and digital copies of information. So people started to develop technical systems in order to kind of build kind of certain ideas about ownership of information, copyright into the technical system. But if the dominant political belief had been that, you know, free and easy exchange of information was a good thing, you wouldn't have had to develop those kinds of technical systems. So the social and the technical are hybrid. So the point I want to end on, because I think I am only going to get through my 3 big points, is that, you know, the social, the legal, the technical combine to form a technology that has politics built into it. And that's the case for sewage systems, and it's also the case for the internet. And the danger is that these become invisible, taken for granted, and I think that's what we need to kind of pay attention to in order to kind of have a good discussion about what the future of the internet should look like. My 3 small points, so you know you can ask me about them later, were about net neutrality, the hype around user-generated content, and a third one about the evils of high-speed broadband access, but I'll leave it there.
I'm at Edinburgh University Institute for the Study of Science, Technology and Innovation. What I'm going to talk to you about today draws upon ideas from my colleagues Ian Graham, Philip Inglesant here, who along with an absent colleague James Stewart, part of a European MyFire project. And there isn't time for me to talk to you about that, but it's a social science project linked to the European Future Internet Research Programme. And you see a kind of European policy programme which looks at this future internet, and you've got different kinds of internet applications, internet of things, and internet services underneath future internet instructions. Is there one internet or is there many internets, we ask ourselves. But there's a kind of planful look about this. It's being assembled purposefully, and the policymakers have some ideas about what's good about the current internet, its resilience, its end-to-end neutral standardized character, which allows collaborative innovation at the interface and separating layers. So these are the good things about the internet we have, but then there are other things we want. For example, how do we deal with all the Chinese players, and how do we deal with issues about security, etc. And a big debate about that. I suppose one of the arguments we would make is that innovation is a long and uncertain pathway. And so what I wanted to talk about was, rather than this idea that we would plan the new internet, to highlight the difficulties, in particular that we need to avoid assuming a linear relationship between the goals and values informing design and the eventual outcomes. And I don't think it's the case that, you know, the best way to design the future artifacts is to do extensive ethnographies into particular workplace settings or particular households and then embed all that knowledge into the artifact. Instead, we're going to be arguing for a different perspective, a social learning perspective which focuses on trial and error interactions between designers and implementers and users with their different knowledge and commitments, etc., etc. So sometimes actually you want to design users out of artifacts. You want to make artifacts generic rather than design specific values and purposes in. So that can be dangerous. So I'm talking a little bit about the social learning perspective. I'll put these, there's too much text here, you can read them later if you want to. But the key point here is that artifacts are reworked, not only when they're designed, but when they're implemented and installed, and when they're made useful and used by users. And as a result, we can't really look at individual artifacts or individual moments of innovation, but we need to look at how artifacts are polished over multiple cycles of design and implementation. And so we talk about, as Sally did, the idea of neutral shaping or ecosystems or social learning. However, that sounds like a kind of a nice, positive, friendly way of getting society and technology to interact. But what I want to say is it's not like that. It's full of conflict and failure. So we're dealing with a fragmented constellation in which there were lots of players. There's no clear innovation hierarchy. There were long chains of intermediate and final players, intermediate producers and users, researchers, equipment manufacturers, ISPs, application developers, content and service providers, business and domestic, and huge gaps between them, and very different concerns and knowledges that they bring to the table. And in that process, we see some players who bridge between these different spaces. We see some spaces where learning can take place, and we have an interest in learning labs as a way in which designers and users can find out about new and emerging challenging artifacts. So, but on top of that, especially when we're looking at infrastructures, we face major problems of path dependency and lock-in. And we're now some years after IP version 6 should have been rolled out, and it's still turning out to be a problematic experience. So lock-in is a big problem. So we have the experience of platforms of innovation, spaces like the internet, which allow lots of innovation to take place within those protected spaces as designers and users and tool developers, etc., can interact. And they're much liked by those who are locked in. They're kind of not so much favoured by those who are locked out. And there is some idea that we should be looking for that in the next generation of the internet, and the idea of generativity has been proposed. And of course, as we begin to change the architectures, I mean, in principle, of course, you keep the different layers separate so that you can innovate in one layer without involving uncertainty in other layers. But as we begin to change the internet, sometimes we may need to change the relationship between layers. We may need to change what counts as a layer. And there are difficulties, I think, in managing the innovation process in relation to infrastructures. So some players are kind of happy when you've got a nice platform. Microsoft was very happy to control the Office suite. Mobile operators sought to monopolize their link with their own customers. I will have a point, I will observe. Zittrain talks about generativity and the wonderful benefits of the internet-enabled PC. But if you wanted a socially inclusive technology, the socially inclusive technology was the mobile phone, not the internet. So these things have complex consequences, and we can't always be sure what the good guys and the bad guys are. What are the inclusive and non-inclusive players? Of course, now with technological convergence, we're seeing new actors emerging. We're seeing Apple and Google becoming infrastructure players. And we may see the emergence of a number of parallel competing infrastructures that may or may not work together very well. So the questions are then, how should we go about shaping the future internet? Well, one idea is to do what the EU has done and say these are the 5-6 things we want the future internet to look like. But of course, we don't know that those things will actually achieve their desired outcomes. We could focus on particular goals. Can we have technologies for electronic identification? Of course, the danger is that you don't know, you can't anticipate the serendipity of the innovation process. And it may well be that if you focus on a particular tool for getting where you want to go, I mean, I remember the EU put lots of money into authorization technologies, but it didn't realise, as eBay told us, that it was self-referencing systems that would actually resolve the question about the certainty and status of the anonymous customer. Different tools may turn out to be the most important one. So the argument is that innovation is serendipitous, that innovation in these complex, difficult confrontational innovation process. There are bridges made between suppliers and intermediate and final users. Those complex interactions lead to unanticipated technical outcomes and unanticipated socio-economic outcomes, positive and negative. In that context, we need what I would call a social learning perspective, flagging in particular the role of experimentation. Experimentation protects hopeful monstrosities and allows them to survive in an otherwise hostile environment. It allows practical problems to be worked on. It allows evidence to be created that some of these new emerging monstrosities may have a future, and it gives points a way to those pathways to actually be exploited in the future. So an experimental framework is what we're looking at. But it may be that we shouldn't even be thinking about designing the future internet. We did a special edition of the Journal of the Association of Information Systems, which looked at information infrastructures, but some of these arguments might apply for fixed infrastructures like the internet. And this flagged that every attempt to build a future information infrastructure is doomed to fail, because you're designing it now, but it's got to be future-proof for a technology that will certainly be different. So you're building tomorrow's legacy systems. So people designing effective information structures need to move away from this kind of idea about planning and design. Instead, they needed to offset a number of tensions. So if you're building a new information infrastructure, you have to cater for now, but you're trying to think about useful applications. You're thinking about particular local uses, but when you're designing it, you're trying not to lock out other future users that may emerge. And a new language has been developed in this way, where we talk, instead of about design and planning, we talk about growing and negotiating in infrastructures. And Pipek and others have introduced the concept of infrastructuring. So maybe we need to rethink how we discuss how those future infrastructures will be put into place. That's all I have to say. Okay, thanks.
Hi. Well, yes, I too will thank the OII and all the people in this sort of growing network I'm beginning to know. I know I've met lots of you before, but in such a strange assortment of locales that I wouldn't begin to try to make sense or order out of them. And I think that's really the theme that I wanted to adopt. When I saw the title, my answer, I had immediately the reaction that Sally had, will it be determined by this or this? Yes. And then I thought, well, in fact, there's no difference. Technology and social forces are precisely the same, and that our old understanding of technology told us that they are precisely the same. Technique, the design, the attempt to manipulate your environment, to take control, to pursue your own interests, is precisely what we do in a social setting. However, there is a continuum, and we're located along that continuum, and those of us who do social sciences, I'm a game theorist by training, recognize this continuum, and I can illustrate it with an experience I had at DTI many years ago on a foresight project on brain science, addiction, and drugs. Another economist and I were doing the State of Science review of the economics of drug taking, and we got up and used the word choice in conjunction with drug taking. And all the neuroscientists, criminologists, everybody in the room burst out laughing. The idea that people would choose was unimaginable to them. Now, technical systems have this property. They don't choose, they behave, they function. And people very often don't choose, they behave, they function. All of us do this from time to time. We allow ourselves to do it. We are optionally less than fully rational. But as an economist, I recognize that rationality is the technology which lies at the heart of my subject, right? It is a technology for translating choice into action, and that action then gets aggregated through systems into things that go on. Now, of course, there are other ways in which there's no difference. Endogenous growth is another way in which there is no difference. Technology doesn't come dropping like manna from heaven. It comes from the purpose of action of individuals, discovering things, making mistakes. It is evolutionary. It's individual and social learning, just as Robin said. But nonetheless, it didn't come from God. And our behavior, therefore, is when we think about an internet as an artifact, well, I don't think it's an artifact in that very reductive sense. It was not designed. I was at RAND. I joined RAND, quite a while ago. And when I did, it was still DARPANET. and we had a closed community of people, and we played games about strategic thermonuclear war, I know, but never mind. This closed community of people began by exchanging masses of data, and we didn't think too much about what we were doing. Because the data exchange was so efficient, we were able collectively to envisage and think about what we were doing. As a result, many of us stopped working on strategic thermonuclear war, although it was an interesting problem, and you could drive it out in some interesting directions. But in that case, we had an internet. It wasn't the technological internet. We had these line editors where you couldn't go back and change anything. And that did sort of change the way in which you thought before you wrote. That was a lesson I took from it. It changed, in other words, the way I behaved as a human being. The technology changed the way I behaved, the way we interacted, and the way we evolved. Well, recently, Konstantin von Aranya and I and some other co-authors wrote a paper on what we called ubiquitous connectivity, and we spoke about the Internet of X, using Internet not as an artifact, but as a metaphor, because of course it's many, many networks layered on top of each other. There are the technical networks, there are the services that flow through them, the networks of institutions, of people, and ideas that are above them. And in that sense, a network, in the sense of a link between this and this, is just a topology, a notion of closeness. And the nice thing about networks is that new layers can pop out on top, and that these distances can change, that things can suddenly become much, much closer. And a change in one layer of the network changes the architecture of all the others. So I think in the sense that the physical technology designs a set of possibilities, just as we as people in our cognition have many things that we could choose to do, the question is which part of these things get lit up, what causes them to light up, what, in other words, are the structures defined on top of these potentials, and what do those structures do for us? Okay, now as I mentioned, rationality is a technology in economics. People who inhabit the internet are not necessarily irrational. They may be differently rational, but any of you who have the privilege of knowing insane people will know that they have very elaborate rationales for what they do, and that many of the most sane people you know don't think about what they do at all. They have embedded it down at the level of intuition. In other words, they've pushed it up the stack or automated it to the point where it is really effective. But as Kurt Vonnegut said, what was it? Fish got to swim, bird got to fly, man got to sit and wonder why. Fish got to something, bird got to land, man got to tell himself he understands. There is a tropism within us to try to grasp hold of something, to try to behave in a rational fashion, to try to function effectively in the world. And in that respect, what we do is that we take our lives as we take the internet, and we use them in particular ways. Now, when we use them, we're treating them as means. And one of the dangers that I see is the fact that the automation of certain functions has made them so capable that we regard them as means even when what we're using as a means is people themselves, is other people, even ourselves. We are encouraged to satisfy our wants. So we're using ourselves as a means to an end, but the end is never really defined. Right? We have these, none of us were born wanting an iPad 2. In fact, if you think about it for a while, you might think, well, do I really need this thing? Right? I have all these functionalities. What is it about it that makes it attractive to me? If I take drugs, I'm using the body as a means to produce a particular sensation. But what we know is that if you use something as a means, it has no free will. There is no significance to its purpose. Therefore, if we have an internet which includes internets of people and of institutions, and we do, in the sense that we have these connections, some people are close, some are far away. Some ideas are relevant to our choices, and our other ideas sit off in the distance until suddenly they become very important. If we understand then the world in which we make these choices, that world has this cognitive framing built into it. And behavioral economics, behavioral finance, behavioral game theory have begun to catch up with this. We recognize that there is something layered on top of the technology. Each one of us may try to make rational choices. We may say, I could do this, this, or this. This is the consequence of this is the consequence of this, and I'll pick the best of them. But two things frame that choice. What alternatives do I consider? And the internet, through its search engines, and the markets through presenting me with options, will tell me what those choices might be. And what consequences of those choices do I take into account when evaluating them? I may take no consequence into account. I may simply behave or follow a random habit. I may take the consequence that you have pointed out to me if you are a marketeer or a politician trying to scare me into behaving a particular way. Nonetheless, I will have acted. The mechanism of my action is a mechanism of evaluation and choice. But that doesn't by itself validate what I do. And that brings me to the second point I wanted to make, which is that when we have a technical system, we attribute to it certain virtues. The automaticity of its operation, the clarity of its design, if it is in particular an isolated system in itself, we think we know what this thing does. Now, if we have a bunch of people who know different things, then in a social mechanism, sorry, was that a... No, I didn't think it was. Then we have certain mechanisms that we use to validate the things that we collectively do. A voting system is one of those mechanisms. The expression of demand in a marketplace is one of those systems. So because the internet, at least its technical possibilities, will support all kinds of things that we can do, you can populate it with an immense variety of devices. The openness of its architecture, the TCP/IP protocol and so on, allows you to hook anything up to it, and then in principle to see whether people want it or not. That's how cloud computing is supposed to work. You provide an open platform. Applications compete on that platform. The ones that work will survive the evolutionary struggle. It's not even a market struggle because we don't necessarily use money to mediate that mechanism. Nonetheless, we have this idea that things are sanctified by the process that results in their choice. Well, that's only the case if the process of choice is somehow outside the system. Now, if I'm choosing between two things that you've offered to me, there's nothing in that choice that reflects what I really, really want. It reflects what I have been offered. And by constraining or influencing my choice, you can determine what I do. So what we make of the internet is bootstrapped by what the internet has chosen to offer us. And here is the problem that I see with one of the major fallacies that underlies this. I think there are a few fallacies. Let me just briefly say what they are and then focus on one. One of the fallacies is, these are sort of monotonicity fallacies, is the fallacy of design or control. We are one tiny part of a complex system. Whatever we build will be used for other purposes. It will do things we didn't intend it to do. And even in the technological world, that doesn't necessarily go uphill. Now, we know this already from evolution. If you have a genome which has one gene in it that interacts with the environment, and you have the three drivers of evolution, variation, natural selection, and heredity, that gene will become fitter and fitter over time. If you have even two interacting genes, it is not possible to design a function which will monotonically increase under the operation of those three forces. So if the world is even slightly complex, this process of evolution or of choice doesn't necessarily drive us uphill. So that means that the use that we make of the technology that's offered from us doesn't necessarily take us upstairs. So we can't reduce human society to a soft technology that works in conjunction with hard technologies in a simple way. There needs to be a reflective function. There needs to be a timeout from which we can ask whether the things that we needed were the things that we wanted, the things that we got, were in fact the things that we needed. Now, the other fallacies are things like the fallacy of information. So if I think that information is good, I might think that more information is better. And from a decision theoretic point of view, that's fine. If I'm alone in the world, or if the world collectively acts like a big human being, like we used to think markets acted, then I can always ignore information, which I don't like. I can always do with more information what I did with less. Maybe I can do more, but I'll only do it if it makes sense. But here again, if you have even two people, that's not necessarily the case. You probably all know the game of prisoner's dilemma. There are two strategies, one's helpful, one's greedy. Choosing the greedy strategy always makes me a little bit better off and you a lot worse off. So we have a dominant strategy of doing the greedy thing. We're all worse off than if we did the helpful thing. But now suppose that you don't know which strategy is greedy and which strategy is helpful. You don't know whether you should give your intellectual property away or charge money for it so that it goes to its most efficient use. I do know. and I move first. Now you watch what I do. If I use my information, then you will know which game we're playing, and we will repeat in either of those games the inefficient equilibrium. If I throw that information away and publicly flip a coin and let Ian choose what happens on the basis of the coin flip, then you know that my action isn't telling you anything. And because I'm randomizing, you may as well randomize as well, if I've got the payoffs right. And then we're not at the efficient outcome, but we're better off than if we'd used the information. That information in the social setting has made us worse off. It's not necessarily true that more information is better than less. So if we have a technological tropism that says control and information and connectivity and continuity of behavior and consistency of behavior are good things, then we may wind up in places that we're not terribly happy with. Now, what has this got to do with the internet, and in particular with what Ian said I was going to talk about, which is complexity? Good, I'm just in the right amount of time. A complex system is a system made by hooking other systems together. Each of these systems we can think of as a domain of rational behavior. It has a rationale, it has a purpose, it has a way of operating. When you put those systems together, different things happen. And I'll conclude with a sort of example of malware on the internet. Now, suppose that I have a machine, and a virtual machine that could be compromised. And the probability that it becomes compromised is proportional to the number of compromised machines to which I'm hooked up. And if it is compromised, with a certain probability, I'll discover it and I'll fix it. The ratio of those two probabilities is something called the effective spreading rate. For any network geometry, any shape of connectivity, there is a threshold above which that compromise will fill the system. For a scale-free network, like we think the internet is and like some social networks are, that threshold is 0, which means that a targeted intervention on highly connected networks works really, really well. But we are very open to any kind of risk, for better or for worse. But now suppose I change it a little bit, and I change it by removing the temporal isolation between the propagation of the risk and the change in the structure. And I say, I can change my links. So I'm connected to Ian. I find out that Ian's machine is now infected. So I drop my link to Ian with a certain probability, and I make a connection to Eric instead. Now the network is rewiring on the same time constant as the propagation of the risk. And what happens? I start with a scale-free network. It rapidly becomes much flatter. In other words, there are many, many more machines with all different layers of connectivity. The second thing that happens is highly connected nodes become connected to other highly connected nodes. So a targeted intervention doesn't work anymore. It only cleans up part of the system, and that gets reinfected from the other bits of the system. A third thing that happens is a new threshold emerges. And above this new threshold, the problem for which I, as an engineer, have devised a solution of cleaning my machine goes away from my machine, but not from the network. It circulates endlessly through the network. And what was an epidemic outbreak has become an endemic problem in the system. But the final thing that I want to close on is that over the course of time, that network will separate into two loosely connected large components. And one of those components will be mostly infected, and the other one will be mostly clean. So this asymmetry in society emerges simply because different things can happen to us, and because we have freedom of association. And if we take a view of the internet that looks only at the possible links where each of us could be linked to all, and doesn't look at who pays attention to who, we'll miss out on that fact. We'll continually be surprised by these disjunctures in society, and we'll be continually seeking technical solutions to a problem which owes its origin to the technology in which we're embedded.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we have up to 45 minutes for debate. If you'd like to make comments, that's great. If you could keep them reasonably short, that would be even better. If you want to ask questions, please say which of the speakers you'd like to direct it to, so that it doesn't turn into as delightful as it is to hear from you, but just endless discussion from the panelists. Please ask one person so that they can respond, so we get a chance. If you could say who you are when you ask your question, that would be great. So who would like to kick off?
The easy way. I'd like to hear about the 3 little points of Sally, if possible.
Thank you, Nicole, and I didn't pay her. The nice, easy question, could you now finish the talk? You didn't plan properly. Yeah, the three small points. One, and Robin also whispered this to me, he said, why is high-speed broadband evil? And this was my deliberately provocative kind of point. And it's evil in conjunction with the growth of smartphones and tablets, because it promotes the internet as a medium of consumption of the products of large media corporations rather than as a medium of interactivity. And this is based on my detailed empirical work since I've been in the country in the last 48 hours. And there are these people with these iPads that we were not born wanting, watching Hollywood movies and reruns of, comedy shows, and I think, this is what we were doing this for? And I know that makes me sound like a kind of old cultural pessimist, but I did have that kind of feeling. And it does go against a lot of the kind of Web 2.0 interactivity kind of hype, which was my other point. Second point was about net neutrality, which, again, net neutrality is a bit like openness. Who's going to be against it? We all are for net neutrality. But I think we have to be a bit kind of more careful about what we mean by net neutrality, and it can mean different sorts of things. And it's partly a kind of more detailed version of my kind of general point that infrastructure and the design of infrastructure kind of matters. So, and net neutrality is basically about how one treats different kinds and sources of internet traffic. And sometimes that's probably not such an evil thing to do, but sometimes it is. So traffic management kind of, to manage loads over time or what have you, overnight, that might be okay. Prioritizing audio and video traffic in order to maintain quality of service might also be okay under certain kinds of conditions. Prioritizing content from a particular content provider is probably never okay. Even worse, exclusive delivery contracts between service providers and content providers would be even less okay. So, and I think we need to think, I know people are thinking about it, including Ian, but I think that's another thing I think that would be interesting to hear more about what some of you think about this who know more about this. And then the third point was about the Web 2.0. And I think sometimes all the hype about Web 2.0 kind of takes our minds off some of the bigger questions around the kind of corporate fights going on around the future of the internet. And this sort of idea that user-generated content, again, it's, who's going to be against user-generated content? It sounds kind of wonderful. But sometimes I think, a lot of it is pretty trivial. And it only becomes interesting in aggregate. And there are people, making an awful lot of money out of those aggregates. And I think it's those sorts of things we should be paying more attention to. But that's partly because I originally studied economics. And sometimes, economics is an incredibly powerful discipline. And, you kind of keep asking some of those old-fashioned economics questions. So those were them. Thank you.
It might cheer you up, Sally, to know that I use my iPad mainly for reading PhD dissertations.
Oh, excellent.
Just briefly to follow up on that. First of all, on the point about economics, because the economics model is logically closed and infinitely analyzable, it has the property that when you look at the world, all you see is the confirmation of the model. It irreversibly changes your foreground and background view, and it's therefore difficult to escape from. But in respect to the high-speed broadband, one of the things that happens is this resonance, that we are given what we buy, and we choose from what we are given, and we get locked into a sterile form of content that is owned by one group of people and endlessly replayed to another. And that capture, that debasement of content and expression into product, which is sold to generate flows of money, and which we read or watch or listen to fill in the time between now and death, is not, there's no external justification for it. It is movement without progress, but it comes back to this point about user-generated content. Susan Blackmore wrote in The Mean Machine, she picked up this little observation from Richard Dawkins at the end of The Selfish Gene, that there are units of cultural evolution just as they are of genetic evolution, and they have this potential property of transcendence. Put three ideas together, and you get a new, complete, and monadic single idea. You don't get a recombination. Whereas genes, the language of which we're all made, is always in the same language. It's just a rearrangement of the same set of letters. It has no emergent property. And it seems to me that the mashup view of what we mean by user-generated content reduces what should be a mean, what should allow us a progression to higher orders of thought, to the level of a gene, to the level of an endless rearrangement of the stuff we had already. And I think that may even be true when we read PhD theses or journal articles, if we look at the pattern of citation, particularly in an internet-enabled world. Because the pattern of citation focuses on the most recent article and the seminal article. Everything in between is gone. So the notion that we build continuously on what was there in the past by detecting and correcting mistakes, that there's some continuity to the body of knowledge as a whole, is not borne out by the pattern of links that we find in co-citation patterns. And the final thing in regard to net neutrality is that there are worse things than charging people different prices, and unperceived traffic management could be one of those worst things. The other aspect of this is that the discussion over net neutrality seems to be conducted in terms of one model of how the internet is used and what it's for, to push paid-for content out to people who do nothing but consume that content. But the same network, which is thus shaped and locked up in walled gardens and so on, should be used for these interactive purposes. It should be more symmetrically open, for example. And so if we build in protections that are based around one business model, we may stop the innovation of other business models, and that, to me, it seems, is the real problem, or one of the real dangers with the net neutrality debate, that it's based on a simplified two-sided market model and a very simple view of what that market is for.
Thank you. Next question or comment? Someone must have been provoked by the net neutrality.
Not so much the network. It almost seems like between Sally and Jonathan, there's sort of, you're saying, on the one hand, people are just consuming stuff. You're critical of simple consumption, sitting in a tablet computer and watching a movie or whatever. But then you're also critical of user-generated content. So if I just consume something, I'm not so good. If I create something on my computer, I'm trivial. I mean, what do we go back to TV or what? What do you want? What do you want? I mean, even science has been criticized for not being cumulative, and so a user mind is not critical. I mean, what do you expect?
Bill, why are you on the planet? I know. I mean this. No. Why are any of us? Why are any of us on the planet? Much of what we do is not about exchanging content. Much of our communication is not about moving the content from one head to another head. Baldwin and Levine, in their critique of intellectual property rights, make this position. We have treated intellectual property as though it were something magical and special. But it's not, really. I have an idea that's in my head. I tell it to you, that with a certain amount of effort and expenditure of resource makes another copy of that thing in your head, right? So it's not magically a public good. You have to use effort to make it into the same thing it is when it was with me. Now, if I sell you a chair, I don't tell you who can sit on that chair or when you can sit on that chair. But if I sell you an idea, I'm somehow magically allowed to do that. So we've given this special status to content. But much of what we do is communication, even when we are apparently exchanging content. I've been married for coming up on 30 years. My wife and I have a lot of conversations. Many of them are repetitions of conversations we've had before. We know what we're going to say. That does not mean that the conversations are not invaluable, but it does mean that they're not about the content. The EU commissions many projects. Many of these projects study wicked issues and come to the same conclusions that they came to before. So somehow it's not about the content. So I think there may be something more than the generation of content or the acquisition of knowledge. I don't know what it is, but clearly we've been doing this for a long time. The Greeks said there are only 7 stories in all of human history. Right? Why do we still tell stories?
Okay, but I do want to make one slight empirical correction, which is that we have in our 2011 study, we've actually looked at patterns of use. And it's quite interesting that the people who do have multiple gadgets and devices and are mobile, iPads and mobile phones, and are using the internet online, are consuming more entertainment, as you
My empirical work
in your 48 hours. But they are also more likely to be producing content. So it is not the case, and so they are more likely to be wedded to sort of a Web 2.0 world. It's so it's both. It's both are happening. So you only saw one side of it, I think.
I mean, I suppose I should, because I was conscious of time and rushed a little bit through it, I think I should also explain that this was a particularly culturally pessimistic view, because the other event where I was just at, I was asked to be the discussant of a paper that was looking at the website hotornot.com, which didn't leave me feeling that the world had become a better place as a result of Web 2.0, because that website is exactly what you think it might be, even if you've never looked at it. You put your photo up and people give you a number from 1 to 10, and this and of course there's all sorts of much more worthwhile user-generated content out there, of course, and most of what all of us do in this room. I mean, academics have been producing user-generated content for kind of centuries. This is kind of what we do, and how we reference it and cite it and build on it is a kind of model for user-generated content. And some of it, I think, is clearly very valuable and very important, but some of it isn't, which is really the point I wanted to make.
Well, I've got a question for, it's a question for Robin, actually, as we're sitting there quietly in the middle with all this user-generated content going on, and I didn't feel he was that kind of a quiet kind of guy. So this infrastructure stuff, you talked about the machine, or the stuff we're going to run it on, and how all the attempts to deliberately make great leaps forward with OSIs, or I think it was you was talking about, I got a bit lost somewhere, I wasn't taking notes, but all that kind of stuff. It hasn't really worked, but yet at the same time, it's quite a competitive environment. And some of the examples we have of platforms emerging, Apache is a good example, the web servers and the huge numbers of standards and ideas and APIs and systems that are emerging, and they compete with each other. And then the ones that get picked up and used a lot are the ones that tend to become part of that infrastructure. So that whole internet platform has just broadened out. We tend to talk a lot about TCP/IP, and some of the more recent history actually kind of takes us a lot further from that. So we've got the web server platform, but we've got the APIs for for virtually everything. And it seems that the environment in which we've created that allows these platforms to sort of grow and evolve, and I do think of it as an evolution. I don't think anybody's really, even Google doesn't control it. It kind of rides the wave, but it doesn't control it. I think we think of that as a good thing, yeah. And as we go forward, looking at the internet of the future, we kind of think, well, that's the kind of environment that we wish to keep going, right? And so I suppose my question is, if we want that to be the case, right? If we want that the next 10 years is as fertile in platform evolution as it has, as the last 10 years has been, what kind of things should we be doing at the sort of the policy level for the sort of this technology infrastructure to make sure that it is as fertile as it has been?
I suppose acknowledging that there'll be failure. My old colleague David Collingridge said we need to hedge and flex. And so hedging was about making sure you have diversity of approaches, and flex meant that you should adopt technologies that could be deviated. And he says that when you see big technological failures, and he was looking at nuclear power, they've usually come from a mission-oriented context. Inflexible social settings produce inflexible solutions. So we need to avoid a kind of mission blindness in our attempts to intervene and promote particular solutions. We need to have, I think there's a particular challenge around the future internet research environment, where we see, really exciting research being done mainly by academic computer scientists, but a huge gap between that and what the ISPs are doing. And of course, there's no automaticity. The ISPs have got why should they take on board the uncertainty of changing their methods of doing? How will final customer demand motivate the ISPs to make those investments, make those jumps? So we need to create an environment in which, I mean, this is why I was emphasising the idea of social experimentation. Is actually that there are good ideas coming up from research settings. Can we actually get these hopeful monstrosities, protect them, get them more accredited, begin to encourage people to invest in them, get them onto the market, and then have a range of competing technologies that will talk to each other? Can we at the same time deal with issues about interoperability and how those different sub-infrastructures might talk to each other?
Well, just going back to the different environments for competitive innovation across the world. And we talked a bit about this during the day. It's obvious, it's apparent that in the US, a lot more of the innovation is VC funded, and it seems to lead to, I'm no economist, but much more rapid adoption of ideas or dropping of the failed ones. We seem to, with our sort of more centralized and more publicly funded research programs, keep plugging away at the stuff that isn't really getting us very far, and not investing very deeply, very quickly in the things that perhaps have a chance of doing so.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting thing is Apple and the App Store. And I'm really frustrated because how many years, 15, 20 years ago, we were looking at Minitel. Why did Minitel succeed when a whole load of other attempts to produce computer-based information services failed? And you remember Charles Reid, who was proposing at the time that Britain would advance its information economy by the state grabbing its information, not letting it out, and charging a hell of a lot for it. Yeah, and then Minitel just said, well, let's provide an infrastructure within which content providers can easily set up services, can easily get the money back. And there was a lot of experimentation, and it succeeded. And hey, we knew that, and yet it took Apple to launch its application store for it to reproduce that and show that the previous model, which we saw, for example, with mobile operators, where they tried to create this kind of closed space, this rather innovative spaces, that didn't work. So why can we not learn lessons from history about what kinds of contexts produce diversity that can lead to benign outcomes being promulgated more widely? Okay. Question mark.
The lady at the left.
Hi, I've always been fed up with this WYSIWYG idea, what you see is what you get idea of things. And I was a bit concerned about Sally saying things might become invisible, because that's really what I'd really like it to be, the internet, just so you don't have to know how to use it, you just use it. That happened a long time ago with Claire O'Malley saying interfaces should be transparent, and someone else saying, oh yes, they've got to be transparent, they've got to be invisible. And I was really keen on Jonathan's view of mixed teams, of getting different people, because developers just do not do any or enough user interface work on things. So what I'd really like to see is much more, and apologies to the gaming machine, WYSIWY, which is actually what we see as what we want.
Thank you. More comments or questions?
Is subsumed into the current one is futile. And that if you think about what has happened over the development of communication systems, the last one was that we used the telephone system for dial-up modems and so on to get the internet out to everybody, and then we developed ADSL and other things. My view is that we have no idea what the future internet is going to look like, but we will use today's internet to support it until we've got technology which will actually be able to do it sort of natively, so to speak. I guess that we will go down the path of putting out IPv6. We'll spend an awful lot of time and effort doing that, and that will not be the solution. I also have a suspicion that what we're doing in the fire projects will also not produce the answer there either. Somebody will have a bright idea somewhere which will solve this, and we'll be able to temporarily implement it on top of what we've got, and then we'll do some clever technology to make it really work.
I have to say, I thoroughly agree with you. I mean, you can. One of the conclusions we made from drawing lessons from history, Sally, was that when you look at the outset of a program of innovation, the beliefs that people have are usually so far removed from the ultimate technical social outcomes that the initial beliefs are uninformative. Remember lasers. What were they? They were death weapons from space. Actually, they're not. They're things that help you play music and help you find out the price of a can of beans. So our anticipatory capabilities are very weak, and we were part of this process. We were doing a project in the mid-90s, social learning and multimedia project, and people were still saying, what's going to be the killer application that will bring broadband into the home and into the workplace? And they were still discussing that after the internet had taken off and was already becoming that killer application, but it took maybe 5-10 years to realize that the future had already started, that next generation was already there. So we're not very good at anticipation, and you're probably right that our attempts, therefore, to try and predict the future and mold it could equally be counterproductive. And there was a lot of investment into huge investments into video on demand, huge investments into teleworking. Whenever we get a preoccupation with a particular model, either of a technical solution or of a social application, we run the risk of actually holding back benign experimentation and benign innovation.
Yeah, I completely agree, of course, because it's right. And actually, on reflection and on listening to this, I think Bill's criticism is right as well. I didn't think that we should actually say that this tendency to be captured by our vision of the current solution, or the current problem, and the notion that a solution was what we should be looking for, that the value came in answering the question somehow rather than asking it, was correct. And taking the social, 2 points. One is social experimentation, and the other one is the evolutionary perspective. What we know about evolutionary systems is that they're not continuous. Punctuated equilibrium is more like the way it goes. Long periods of small localized change, mission-orientated solutions to problems that are small enough to get our heads around, followed by brief periods in which everything changes, things that are not connected to each other change, and the whole world changes quite rapidly. So even whether it's going to be an internet, I have a project on putting energy labels online. We're trying to write a legal instrument called a delegated act, and we were brought up short by somebody from Microsoft, a very wise gentleman named Andreas Ebert, who pointed out that under natural user interfaces, anything we write into law that has browsers at the heart of it will rapidly become an irrelevance. Clicks will have no meaning. Hyperlinks, in the sense we understand them, will have no meaning. And that this is not a wholly exogenous development. But I do have to say that there is also the sense in which even though these views may be uninformative, they are nonetheless formative, because they shape the things that we do. And there are cascades in human behavior. It can rapidly reach the point where we will rationally ignore the things that we know in favor of what we think everybody else knows, and where our successes can actually retard our progress, not just our failures. And the example I would cite here is standardization, and in particular GSM standardization. Yes, it was a big success. We happened to be able to get our act together while the rest of the world was messing around. And my phone in LA, and I have to say, having worked for Rand in LA, that lasers are death weapons from space as well. X-ray lasers anyway. But my phone in LA wouldn't work in Washington, D.C., right? So we got it right there. And we knew that we'd gotten it right. And we took a lesson from it, which was wholly inappropriate, because it succeeded for other reasons. And we have spent many years and how much money trying to repeat that success without much success. So I think absolutely I agree that this is a process of mistakes. That's sort of what I meant by the fallacy of design, but you expressed it much more clearly.
So you could blow up Washington from space, but you couldn't make phone calls
Yes, yes.
Sally?
Just a couple of points. Of course there are kind of many examples of kind of discontinuous change, but there are also many examples of kind of lock-in, path dependency, And I think, you know, we have to kind of think about that. Are there certain kinds of things that it's going to get harder and harder to do as we go down particular sorts of paths? And I also have a question for Jonathan. I've always wanted to ask a kind of real economist this question.
Sorry to disappoint.
And that's I mean, I know, and I have a certain kind of sympathy certainly for evolutionary economics, but I'm a little less sympathetic to the kind of wholesale borrowing of kind of evolutionary ideas to social and economic problems. And one of the reasons, I mean, you talk about the kind of variation and selection, but in evolutionary theory, if I remember my Darwin correctly, these are independent processes, but they aren't independent in economic life.
No more were they independent in the sort of social Darwinist abuses of Darwin. And if you read the religious fanatics, like our own homegrown one from the city himself, you'll find that the motif of combining these three different notions of, let's say, mistakes and market testing or scientific evaluation and mimesis, or copying other people's behavior or solutions, the combination of them produces movement. But the sense in which that movement is adaptive, the sense in which we can even think in a social setting of fitness or a fitness domain, of separating the organism from its environment, which is what Darwin had to do. Remember, this is scientific theory, so it's reductive, and the reduction there was to separate the organism from the environment. I don't think we can defend that in a social context, nor do I think that even internally, I mean, if we talk about networks, within each of us are many, many desires, many, many aspects of identity that are networked to each other. So just as a game theorist would tell you that the game in here is as important as the game among people, I think a network person who tried to do this evolution on networks would probably tell you that it's only a metaphor. It's not a model, it's not a technology, and any critique you make of it, I would almost certainly agree with. But just one small thing on lock-in. When Brian Arthur and company were writing about that, they also pointed out that if you link these systems together, you get breakout as a consequence of lock-in. And Lute Leidesdorf in the triple helix thing, I'm sure you know Lute,
I know
has written quite persuasively on that.
Okay. Any more questions or comments? Yeah.
The idea that there's something terrible about the internet because people... Is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
There's idea that there's something terrible about the internet because people are using it to consume content rather than to produce. Really reminds me of stuff that was being said in the 30s by Adorno and people like that. I mean, the bandwidth of somebody throwing an image onto a screen, you know, is enormously much more one-sided than it is in the bandwidth in ADSL. So I guess the rather obvious question is, what, if anything, is special about the internet that makes it so much more evil than the mass media of the 1930s and even the 1890s, if it comes to that, of the 1960s?
Yeah, speed and reach, I would say, speed and reach. That quantitative improvements at a certain point can produce qualitative changes in the system, and the nature of those qualitative changes, just mathematically, comes in a sudden loss of degrees of freedom. Things become aligned very quickly. That's what we saw in the genesis of fascist societies. And the way in which cascades can propagate through the internet, single ideas that reorganize all the diversity of people's activity, I think it's not a new thing, but in scale and in our ability to recognize it before it has happened or become locked in through path dependence and irreversible, in other words, embedded in other things that we have done, I think in that sense, and the fact that it's global, right? You can't control it with a law. So.
It's interesting looking at the figures from TV broadcasters. They seem to be seeing more TV watching and platforms like YouTube becoming more like TV, that people are actually using them very little so far for really any quantity of user-generated content.
Can I just follow up on that in a sense? I mean, this isn't really my world. It's much more around evolutionary economics, endogenous growth, and so forth. But I remember doing a study several years ago, Nicole Devando will remember it, which was looking at the gender dimension of ISTs at that stage. And it was very much about digital divides, about the gender differentiation in terms of those who were using and consuming, I suppose would be the word here, the internet resources and so forth at that stage. If we'd been having that conversation, or this conversation at that time, then we would have been mightily disappointed by the type of content which was available upon the web at that time, because it was largely male-orientated, it was very sport-orientated, and it was also very pornographic in terms of the way that it came forward. And yet the very nature of the demand that was coming forward was forcing technological change at the same time. And in a sense, these are all a continuum, the ways that you've been talking about these things. The fact that people are consuming the technology for what might be seen as trivial uses may not be trivial to them, and it may also be leading to new activities in the future as people supply new technologies, supply technological solutions to the bandwidth problems which are coming forward, and then new ideas can come on board on top of that at that stage. So from an evolutionary perspective, all change is good in that respect. And we don't actually know how it's going to work out, because nobody really realized that Skype was going to be the reason that older women became very computer savvy, because they were able to contact their grandchildren by using Skype at the time. So these things happen for reasons we don't know a lot of the time.
Slightly different. I think another reason why the internet, it bothers people, is it's new. And because you notice that nobody talks about TV anymore. TV is just as evil as ever, isn't it? But nobody talks about it anymore. But could I just try to point out, try to address the question on the panel, but put it in a different way. Let me try to exaggerate, but I will say we haven't really mentioned public policy at all. But I think public policy could kill the internet as we know it. And I think that this is an example of social concerns trumping technology in a sense, perhaps. Maybe that's but if that's true, if we're at a brink of actually public policy that completely undermines the real vitality of the internet, is that do you think that that's a possible outcome in the next 5 to 10 years? And do you think that's an example of social concerns driving technology versus the other?
Could I ask Jonathan to address that? Because you've done a lot of work with the EU on the issue.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. There was the project that we were involved in, the Towards a Future Internet project. We produced in it a number of scenarios. And earlier today, I heard some mention of part of this aspect of the openness of the internet and the attempts to enclose certain parts of it, whether it's intellectual property, the projection, in other words, of meat space power into cyberspace. And I think that there are two real dangers that go along the lines that you suggest. One is the notion that behaviors, things that we try to control, have escaped our control onto the internet, whether they've escaped our boundaries or have taken new forms, and that therefore our responsibility, which came in real space from the impacts of those behaviors, should follow to the regulation of those behaviors in cyberspace, without examining whether the regulatory impacts or the regulatory case, the case for action, remains to be made, and whether it should be made by governments which, although they are sovereign governments in their own countries, are simply interested parties in the internet domain, and they will do things that will indeed distort this process. But we also heard, albeit briefly, about the interaction between the internet and politics, the influence the government that the internet has on governance. And what we heard about was the sort of positive side of the picture. The Facebook revolution, or supposedly, the idea that flash mobbery could mobilize what everyone was thinking and turn it into action that no one could ignore, that it would somehow link in the rest of the world and so on. And that what this was evoking was the great firewall of China and things like that, and that therefore there would be these overtly repressive aspects. But I don't think that that's the whole picture, because I think that what we're seeing is that if we impute trust to things on the internet, because we know that they are demotic, anonymous, and broken down to little levels, we open ourselves up to the possibility that the government can exploit the internet, exploit these very tools, subvert them, and harness them to their own purposes by sowing disinformation. So that's sort of point one, which is that the threat may not be the threat that we think. It may not be from regulation. It may rather be from the wholehearted embrace of what should be a democratic and open platform, or at least a competitive one, by forces that are not in their character. But the other thing is, of course, that these governments are elected, and to a large extent, an increasing extent for things that capture the imagination, they are populist. And when things capture the imagination, other bad things happen. One of the persuasive explanations for the subprime crisis is that the story of subprime lending so captured the imagination of markets around the world that everyone began to pay attention to the New York Stock Exchange and the Fed. And that alignment of their behavior that everyone knew it was happening meant that all of a sudden these sort of trivial things in some little part of a network became enormous influences on the world at large. And so if we get governments that get bounced into net neutrality, that get bounced into extending telecom-style regulation or broadcast-style content regulation onto the internet because of the mobilization through the internet of political forces that are, or people who are afraid of this novelty, who are afraid of this continual process of change, I think that together, in other words, the internet and governments could destroy not only the internet as we know and love it, but also government as we've come to believe in it. So, yeah, now that you mention it, I'm probably even more pessimistic. Thanks a lot for that.
I find it very odd to be in a platform where the majority seems to be rather despondent about the future, rather full of caution and anxiety. I mean, I have to say, the point about gender exclusion and, 10, 20 years ago, lots of concern about women not being involved. And oddly enough, it was, the thing that really got women involved was, first of all, the mobile phone, and then email, and it was its communication capability. And that flags a number of things. One is that those weren't designed outcomes, they were actually user reinventions, repurposing. SMS and email were both engineering functions whose true significance wasn't recognised by those developers. They were reinvented by the user. So I think we should look at the technology development effort, but also look at the other effort that the user makes to reappropriate, to domesticate, to make what was difficult their own, to fit it to their own purposes. And users are unlikely to embrace technologies that impinge upon their interests and their perceived desires. So I'm optimistic rather than pessimistic. I know my parents hated me watching the television, but it didn't kill me. People tell me my kids, if they play computer games, will turn into brainless zombies, unable to socialise. And I see that computer games become a method by which kids communicate and socialise together. So I'm optimistic about the ability of citizens to engage creatively if we provide spaces where they can decide what the thing is, to adapt it to their purpose, to play with the thing and find out how useful it is. And one consequence is, I think, rather than hold back, I think there are dangers, but there are bigger dangers from restricting connectivity than from enhancing it. I think in this area, if we're anxious about technologies and try and control their adoption, sometimes that also has unintended and undesirable consequences. And the more connectivity there is, the more opportunity there is for people to find productive applications of these communication facilities that we're giving them. So I'm an optimist.
That's good. Do you have any more optimistic conclusions before we wrap up?
Could I just say one little thing? It's very optimistic. No, I didn't mean to say, just by saying that there's a risk or a danger, doesn't mean that I think that risk will fire, or that will be manifest. One of the things that we've been hearing about recently is the way in which cognition changes through the use of the internet. Individual cognition, and therefore its aggregation into social cognition. We have much more access to information. Now, for people who come from my generation, when the technology of information acquisition imposed huge barriers to the acquisition and rapid scanning and summarization of these large amounts of information, that seems like a bad thing, right? It is an obsolete technology, perhaps, in the same way that the copying of books. I mean, copyright exists because I could use your written output without making a copy. I could not steal it without making a copy. On the internet, both of those are reversed. I can not use it without making a copy, and I can steal it through linking without making any copy at all, the wrong property right, and by attempting to preserve it with this thing that puts deep packet inspection everywhere, we've probably done quite a lot of damage, or at least the US has. On the other hand, I don't have any other frame for saying that this alternative cognition to which the collective use of the internet by digital natives is giving rise is necessarily a bad thing. It's a different thing, and it's a world in which I will, as a, what do they call them, digital immigrant, something like that, it's a world in which I will have to struggle for survival, and that which survives with me in my discipline is very different than that which I set out to do. But I'm certainly not saying that it's a bad thing in any other sense than that the old era passeth away. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good optimistic point to end on. So thank you all for staying right to the end, and could you thank again our three speakers, Sally, Robin, and John.